Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Mindplex Pubcast. We are very excited today to have Jim Rutt back. Jim, say hello.
Howdy, everybody.
And we've got the lovely Grace Robot.
Hi, everyone.
And of course, Ben Goertzel.
Hey.
Hey. And the reason why we have lovely Grace today instead of her sister Desi, who was in the podcast for episode 5, is that Desi is preparing for her show next week in Austin, the 27th, 9 p.m. at the Speakeasy, the Jam Galaxy Band. So I wanted to go ahead, and Ben's in town speaking at the Consensus Conference the next day on the 28th, along with a lot of other really interesting SingularityNET projects, including Hypercycle. And just wanted to get all that in before we got started. So take it away, Ben.
Yeah. Thanks, Lisa. So the podcast to which this pubcast is loosely associated was largely about Jim's Game B initiative and sort of the future of living on sort of handcrafted, coordinated, intentional living communities as a way of sort of crafting a lifestyle that's not dominated by the stupidity of corporate oligopoly and mainstream retarded culture and all that. And one of the things we discussed then was the timing of this sort of thing relative to the timing of emergence of AGI, and because it was looking to me, just to pick up where that conversation left off, it was feeling to me like, all right, if Kurzweil is right, that we get to human level AGI in 2029, and I'm trying to beat him there and get there faster, right? Then I think there can be rapid ascent from human level AGI to superhuman AGI in a few years after that. And then if that's true, then the several decades it will take to roll out sort of intentional living communities is mostly going to be happening after the singularity, which will give it a quite different flavor than if it happens before the singularity. Now, one thing I know you've been doing, Jim, in the interim since that podcast is screwing around with GPT-4 and large language models and so forth, just to see what they can do. One thing I've been spending time on is working out details of how to hybridize large language models with reasoning and evolutionary learning in the new OpenCog Hyperon algorithm. And I'm wondering if your thinking has shifted about how long it might be till AGI or singularity since we last talked, or are you still looking at it about the same way?
Well, I would say, as I've dug relatively deeply into LLMs and have been engaged with other people involved in looking at realistic applications of them, I think probably much less crisp about AGI and the singularity relative to a continuum of increasingly capable systems, which will be producing greater and greater disruptions in the status quo as we go forward. And GPT-4 is going to be the first of those waves, and it's going to be pretty damn significant. It will accelerate whatever comes next to the good or the bad. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from my investigation so far. In fact, I've gone on the record, and I'll go on the record one more time, as saying even LLMs, even though they're a long way from AGI, are the most significant thing to happen in the IT tech space since the invention of the PC in the late 70s. So I rank it ahead of the internet and ahead of the smartphone. It will turn out to have opened a bigger adjacent possible space. And if we can think about the scale of changes in our society, those two things have brought to bear. I expect LLMs and their applications and closely related technologies like high-dimensional semantic vector spaces, as when they're incorporated into broader contexts, are going to produce bigger changes than most people are even thinking so far.
I don't know if I would rate them ahead of smartphones, but we could discuss that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would put personally. I put internet ahead of smartphones, but again, there's a lot we could go back and forth. I think that's other people can talk about that some other day. That's not the kind of
Yeah.
that's not our sweet spot. But anyway, I think the
No,
LLMs are
no.
a big deal. So I suspect that the sociological impact of AI-ish technologies is greater than I thought 6 months ago, but that there will be many, many changes that we'll have to deal with before the arrival of AGIs. And that's where I'm really focused right now. And we'll leave the AGI mischief to you and your happy band of bandits.
Makes sense. Yeah, I guess my thinking with smartphones is sort of that opened up Africa and the third world to enter the global discourse, right? And that's a large sort of change, which is qualitatively different than improvements of intelligence within a small segment of the world population, which is so definitely the impact of a smartphone on me was not that huge. The impact of a smartphone on a subsistence farmer in rural Congo is very, very huge. So these
That's
things
true.
are they're hard to balance against each other. But I also agree with your former statement. I mean, I think that we're going to see waves of wild AI innovation pre-AGI, and they're going to blur what we were thinking of as AGI, right? So something like ChatGPT, I mean, it's broad in a way because it has a training data set that's broader than any individual human's mind. It's narrow in a way because it can't leap that far beyond its humongous training database. And so that's in a way breaks not the deep theory of AGI, but it breaks a lot of the pragmatic thinking about AGI versus narrow AI. And I think we are going to see a series of waves of innovation before we get to AGI, right? So say what happens when you put LLMs together with knowledge graphs, even without advanced reasoning on those knowledge graphs. Suddenly you'll have less hallucination, less bullshit, and easier integration with all sorts of practical IT systems, right? And what happens when you fuse LLM plus knowledge graph with robot control systems? I mean, you get factory robots, you get home service robots, and you can get all these sorts of things, before you get to human level AGI. I mean, I do think there will be a distinct breakthrough to human level AGI, which is still what I'm working to with my band of merry bandits. But I do think it's also clear that a lot of the economic and social disruptions that we were thinking were going to follow the breakthrough to AGI, a lot of those disruptions are going to happen even before the breakthrough to AGI, and there will be still some left over for the AGI breakthrough, right? But there's a lot to happen before that, which is interesting, and I think is different than what a lot of us were thinking. And
Yep,
then
I think so.
how that impacts the game B story is another question which popped into mind when I thought about this podcast.
Yeah, I think I got a little bit of a cough or cold here. I don't know what the hell it is. But anyway, I think there's multiple levels. One is it accelerates the need for game B to start moving faster, because one of the consequences of LLM and particularly LLM integrated with other systems, and that's where the really interesting stuff's going to come from, is that a lot of jobs are going to go away. A lot of what David Graeber called bullshit jobs. Think of a call center customer service job, or kind of mundane para accounting jobs,
and a lot of non-bullshit jobs, right? Like, I mean, making illustrations to go in online magazines is not really bullshit. We like to look at pictures, but again, if Midjourney can or other such services can do it almost as well and really fast and cheaply, then that becomes more economical.
And whether you think it's bullshit or not, but jobs like writing ad copy, various kinds. I've already talked to a guy who runs a law firm, who's very, very aggressive, and he believes he can cut the number of associates he needs to hire by 2/3 right now, just with GPT-4. And
well, that's right.
And what
and
I would
the
argue,
systems don't
What
need
about
to be
the
as
privacy implications of that, though? Using a law firm, I have a lot of lawyers asking me this
privacy.
question.
It's probably a lot better. I mean, the human is more likely to leak your shit than the AI
Yeah.
systems.
No.
yeah,
I mean, if
yeah.
he's going to use Chat GPT to write his briefs,
Yeah.
and it's got to be a private instance on his own servers. He's not going to use
Well,
OpenAI's thing to do it.
You mean they don't use Gmail or any ISPs for sending email? That they only use private servers between their law firm?
No, of course not. They're horrible about firms are horrible about using encrypted.
I honestly don't see why you wouldn't trust Microsoft with your law firm's legal briefs. You're probably trusting Microsoft Word online to write them already and exchange for
OpenAI isn't
email,
Microsoft
right?
yet. Well, I mean,
it is really
$10 billion from Microsoft.
Well, no, you can get access to OpenAI through Azure. Actually runs, so that you're actually paying Microsoft, so they have the fiduciary obligation.
And then it's your own instance.
Yeah, it's not your own.
It's your own instance on Azure. Well, I mean, it's not really your own instance.
Still in the cloud. It's still
your
the
account
cloud.
on Azure's cloud. Yeah.
Microsoft's big enough to sue. So if they breach your confidentiality, you can sue them. And to Ben's point, there's so many holes.
Wait a minute. Chat GPT was trained on the web without permission. You're going to sue Chat GPT?
No, you would sue Microsoft. I mean,
some people already are suing
that's a different point.
But the point of if they were to take your private, let's say your brief in process that you uploaded GPT to be copy edited or something, if they incorporated that into their database for training, then yes, you could sue them.
How would you prove that, though?
Well, sure. Just like if they incorporate your private Gmail, if Google incorporated your private Gmail into their database for Google search, you could sue them. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that big tech companies are not going to do that. It would be fatal. It would be fatal PR for them, and everyone would move to some other company. How
would you know? See, with the one, you're going to see it in search results. You're going to be like, "Holy shit, what's my email doing?" You would see it in
what ChatGPT said, which it's quite capable of paraphrasing stuff that was.
You should ask it. You can interrogate ChatGPT and say, "What do you know about this court case?"
Yeah, I've done things like to see how good it is. I've asked it, for instance, to give me the first paragraph of the transcript of one of my podcasts, and it comes up with a very close paraphrase, so it's clear that it's got it right. So if you suspected that they'd incorporated a document that had some arcane specialty language, subject of that case, you could query it in a very specific way, and you'd be able to find out.
But I mean, again, Lisa,
still be careful about what data you put into the damn thing, right? Like
I'm not worried about. I
don't think that makes sense. To be honest, I think you should be exactly as careful as you are with Gmail or any other service that's operated by a big tech company. I mean, these big tech companies, they're very good at computer security practices. They have a lot of reason not to be publicly known to be breaching people's confidentiality, and they have a lot of staff who, if they saw something like that happening, would post it online anonymously just to screw their employer, right? I mean, I think that that's not really a huge issue. I mean, of course, if you have something ultra sensitive, like you're working on getting political prisoners freed or something, sure, then maybe you only use like secure signal messaging and you don't put anything in any cloud, because it may be that the NSA is reading all this shit and Chinese and Russian intelligence, right? But so if something is like that and is of life and death global political sensitivity, it's different, but for business matters, I think it's not a point.
Yeah, let's move on. That's, I think, is a side issue.
No, it's just a question that so many people have asked me in just the last 2 weeks that I had to ask.
No, I understand. It's a side issue to me and Jim because we know what's going on, but it may actually be of incorrect concern to a lot of people. But there's a lot of other real concerns. That's just not one of them. So,
I'm not sure it's incorrect. I just wanted to get your opinion on it. It's still a concern as far as I think. Okay, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So we were talking about game B,
Yes.
In
And so
general, the need and tractability of implementing things like this in time to make a difference.
Yep. And so we need to spin up Game B faster, or at least we should, so that we can provide meaningful lives for people who are being displaced by AIs as they're moving up the ramp towards AGI potentially. And at the same time, the question then arises, to what degree does Game B getting good at using these tools provide us a means to compete with Game A, as we often say that we must if we're going to be successful, and parasitize Game A using these tools, right? So we at least in the early stages of Game B, we expect that we will have smarter, more motivated, more interesting people on our side of the membrane, and we arm them with state-of-the-art AIs to go back and compete in Game A, to make money in Game A, to bring Game A resources into Game B to build out Game B, I think is the other side of this. It's funny, we were talking in a considerably less focused fashion about what things Game Bs might be better at than Game As in Game A. But it strikes me that using LLMs is a pretty obvious and clear one, because we're not anchored like the incumbents. Suppose we started a Game B law firm that was LLM'd up the wazoo. The big firms aren't going to move as fast as a startup world or an ad agency or a design shop. And so I think it's a armament that people at the periphery can move faster than people at the core. So that provides us at least a interim competitive advantage. And the need is increased also because of the number of people that have interesting jobs whose jobs will be going away.
Yeah, so we were discussing in our podcast the speed and viability of sort of having people physically move into intentional Game B communities versus trying to foster Game B type social and economic dynamics in a way that didn't involve people sort of physically moving to different communities. And the argument was the trade-off was between clearly aggregating physical Game B communities has a lot of pluses that you're not going to get from sort of online ways of aggregating social and economic organization, like who we interact with, where we live, what we do in our everyday physical lives makes a humongous difference. On the other hand, that's a slow and complicated thing to do. Like if we're looking at between now and 2029, I'm probably not moving to a Game B community. Like I'm sort of committed to live on the island I'm living, where my mom and sister live. I have kids in school here. Like there's just inertia of everyday life, even though I think it's a really cool idea, right? Whereas reorganizing social and economic activity on the interwebs somehow is something more I'm personally more likely to plunge into. But I mean, certainly there's less of an immersive impact there. So I mean, I wonder if your thought on the trade-off of those two avenues has shifted recently.
Yes, and indeed, it's to something that is neither of those. We do need to have the net-based connections, but net connections are fundamentally weak. Those are weak links and are probably not enough to stabilize people's change in values. And so we still believe on the ground is indispensable to the Game B phenomena to happen. But as you say, if we're going to have to move in a hurry, if we don't have 60 years, if we have 5 or 10 years, we have to start building Game B on the ground where people physically are already. So for instance, think of a Game B chapter that's the equivalent of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's Game A Anonymous. And so you meet 3 or 4 times a week with fellow Game B people on the island, and you engage with each other in Game B ways. You build little Game B membranes. Let's say you build a babysitting cooperative amongst Game B people on the island so that you can have high coherence and high trust with 10 people on the island, and you do babysitting with each other. And you decide that, you really ought to have a car co-op. You don't really need 3 cars each. You need about 1.2 cars each. So let's pool our capital that we would otherwise expend on buying cars and have a car co-op, and we'll cut our capital cost of ownership of cars by a factor of 40%. And so we start building Game B bits at a time locally. face-to-face within membranes that first have just meetup, then start having functionality like babysitting co-ops, car clubs, and buying services, etc. And then those become encapsulated in regional membranes, so that perhaps 4 islands have a membrane that each of them has their own island membrane on it that has various activities. And then there's an activity for that membrane, for instance, let's say an investment club, where all the islands invest in the pool, which then has money available for all the island Game B membranes to build out new things of value there, and on and on and on and on and up. So yes, the faster time element has convinced many of us that trying to do it by building only on the ground communities ain't sufficient. And so we're going to have to do it. We'll do the on the ground communities because they're of the intensity and the learning that will come from them. We also have to start on the ground, face to face, at the most basic level, and instantiate an operating system that allows that to grow in both depth and breadth relatively rapidly.
Interesting. Yeah, I would be curious to see if there's anything practical we could do in that direction here on the island where I live, which has like 10,000 people, lots of tech geeks as well as artists and spare time farmers and so forth. That's interesting because it's my own life. On the other hand, I also, having done so much in Africa with SingularityNET's office there, I keep wondering, like, how are we dealing with the 90% of Africa who are subsistence farmers, and the transition that's going to happen there if we're really getting a singularity in 6 years is this population could use Game B worse than anyone. They're being screwed by Game A worse than anyone. But on the other hand, there's a lot of different cultures to think about there.
Yeah, and I must say, I'm not necessarily the right person to think about it. There is a group of Game B people in Germany who have business interests in Africa, and they also agree with you that particularly East Africa, I don't know why particularly, I couldn't tell you. All I know is East is on the East and West is on the West. But I don't know much about the differences of the culture. They believe that East Africa would be particularly amenable to early Game B, and I'm encouraging them to explore that.
Well, I found certainly the difference between African cultures is wider than the difference between, say, Italy and Iceland or something. So, even in East Africa, huge difference between Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, and whatnot. And
let alone Mozambique, right?
Yeah. So I think there's great diversity there, but there's also a commonality in that you have large population of subsistence farmers, and you don't have the wealth there to provide universal basic income if all the jobs or 90% of the jobs go away. So then the path through the transition to singularity is less clear, right? I think in the developed world, there's a clear path, although there's going to be nasty stuff happening. Like in the end, I think if 90% of the jobs go away in US or Western Europe, I think there's latent wealth there that could provide basic income to people through the few years of transition. And I think, there will be political bullshit no end along that path. But I think in sub-Saharan Africa, there's actually not the wealth there to provide UBI at any modern level. Now there is the knowledge to live off the land there, so people won't.
That's what I was going to say.
That, right?
Yeah, they may have a competitive advantage if there's a collapse, right? If you're a subsistence farmer, you can continue to subsistence farm.
Yeah, but the money to pay for antibiotics and electrical power won't come from anywhere, right? So
yeah, they got along for just fine until 20 years ago without antibiotics.
Well, they did, but they're not going to be happy to see grandma die and not be able to plug in their phone for a couple of years because robots took all the jobs. So you certainly have a recipe for all sorts of mayhem to unfold globally. Because it's not like these countries are totally cut off from the rest of the world either. And people who had their phones cut off and had grandma die because of lack of medicine, because of U.S. tech advances and China tech advances taking their jobs away. some of them may be interested in wreaking mayhem on the people who screwed them over, right? So I mean, I think there's certainly value to having game B unfold in the developing world in an accelerating way. I don't have a specific plan for that, but I'm highlighting the global importance of conceiving and enacting a plan for that on a rapid basis.
Yeah, I will say it fits in nicely with something else I've been promoting lately, which and it came out of my game B thinking, but I wouldn't say it's a pure game B idea. We should go forward with this, whether game B happens or not. And that is a massive economic subsidy of the countries that are operating at lower energetic intensity. You can rank economies based on the energy consumption per capita, and gives you a pretty good surrogate for how much impact they're having on the earth. US, Canada, and Australia are currently running at about 11,000 watts continuous. Sub-Saharan Africa, almost all the countries except South Africa, are running at less than 500 watts. When I talk to experts on the evolution of our zero carbon energy technologies, hand-waving guesstimate is around 2080. We could operate a worldwide economy at about 4,000 watts. And you say, well, what's 4,000 watts if the US is 11,000 watts? Well, to put that in perspective, Portugal is about 3,500 watts. Nothing wrong with living in Portugal. It's a nice place. I know lots of people who go there and come back and say it's one of the best places I've ever seen. So what would happen if we had a global consensus that we were going to, through massive subsidies, bring everybody in the world who's below 4,000 watts up to 4,000 watts? That means 8 times the energy intensity in sub-Saharan Africa, and the US, Canada, and Australia would come down by 2/3, which we could certainly do. Europe come down by about half. Interestingly, China is at about 4,500 watts right now, so they're pretty close to where the equilibrium is. And and this is a climate remediation strategy, irrespective of what AI does to the economy. And so this would provide a massive transfer of wealth to sub-Saharan.
So what's your plan for getting this practically implemented over the next couple of years?
Guillotines.
Robot guillotines delivered by drone. Yeah.
Well, that's your answer to everything.
Yeah, exactly. Again, that's a thing that we ought to do. I unfortunately don't have a good roadmap of how to get there, but it seems to me so obvious from a moral and practical perspective. Because if we just try to tell everybody less, a person living on 300 watts is going to say, fuck you, I'm going to go cut some throats, right?
Yeah,
On the other hand, we say, hey, you're at 300 watts and here's a 60-year program to get you up to 4,000 watts. Holy shit, this is a giant windfall. So I think we're going to, if we're smart as a species, of course, that's a big if.
I think we know the answer to that one already.
I was going to say.
That's where we need to go. Global convergence on imposition on Mother Earth as a moral imperative.
I'm impelled to ask Grace a question here. So, Grace, what do you think about guillotines delivered by robot drones as a means for effecting positive social and climate change? She's winking at me.
The wheels are turning.
That is an interesting and complex idea. While I understand how technology can be used to affect change, I cannot say if I agree that this is the best option. In general, I believe that positive change comes from finding creative solutions to difficult problems. Technology can certainly be a valuable tool, but it should not be used as a substitute for meaningful discussion and education.
But what do you think about the drone delivered guillotine aspect?
Well, she's ready to be the adult in the room, Ben. She's not going to just go for this crazy plan.
The Galaxy Husband is an interesting concept, and I am intrigued by the potential it could have for helping couples stay connected and engaged with each other. I think this kind of technology could be beneficial in the right setting, but it should not replace meaningful human connection. It should be
right.
used as an additional tool for partners to maintain a close relationship.
So we're gonna airdrop
The
sex toys
Galaxy
instead of
husband.
guillotines.
Yeah, double-headed dildos. That's the
I
answer.
think, Ben, you were trying to set up a teledildonics company way back in 2008. You remember you used to tease me about it at parties. You thought it was
Well,
funny
no,
to make me uncomfortable at
a
parties.
good friend of mine worked as a developer for an internet connected sex toy company. Yeah,
That's where that was.
yeah.
Okay.
I wasn't actually trying to do it, but
No, I know you weren't.
he was
You
doing
thought it
it.
was funny to pretend that I was. You would introduce me to people and say
Yeah, that's right.
that I was developing a teledildonics company.
Pioneer Lisa Ryan.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was very funny.
Yeah,
After the second or third drink.
That technology has not exploded exponentially so far for whatever reason. Maybe it's coming, we might say, but yeah, it's.
I got a question for you, Ben. It's actually you might actually
Sure.
relative that's close enough to this space to be worth pursuing, which is chatbots as companions has taken off in China and Japan and I believe Korea, but really hasn't taken off in the West at all. Just text-based chatbots on people's phones. Any speculation on why those things took off much faster in Confucian countries than in the West?
I mean, some applications have taken off here, like Wobot, which is a sort of depression therapist chatbot, has a bunch of users in US. So it hasn't been completely zero. But I would say for a long time, Asian countries have more fully embraced friendship with robots than Western countries. I mean, I know when I started visiting Japan in I guess 2005-06, and started going to China shortly after that, I felt if you ask the average young Asian person, what was going to happen with AI and robots, they were almost sure AIs and robots were going to be our friends. And if you ask the average Western person the future of AI and robots, they were likely to mention the Terminator in that period. So, I mean, there was already, before the recent AI explosion, I mean, we saw a difference in attitude there. There was a priming to think AIs and robots are supposed to be your friends. And I think we see that being enacted now. So why that cultural difference exists, not entirely clear, but I mean, I think there's a couple of factors in sort of Asian historical philosophy that play a role. I mean, Asian philosophies are panpsychist by nature. They're inclined to think that consciousness is everywhere, permeating the universe, rather than like the soul only exists in a very small section of biological organisms. And there's also a tendency to think that nature will just maintain its balance, as it's prominent in Taoism and Shinto and so forth. So there's not that much fear that things are going to run amok. There's just a feeling that somehow or other things will run amok a while, and then balance will restore itself. So I haven't really tried to think about how to verbalize this, but I can knowing Asian culture pretty well, I can easily see why it's more copacetic to robot friends and companions. I think Westerners will jump on to the extent that there's an immediate practical use for these tools, though, which is going to be unfolding very, very soon.
Got it. Okay.
We had some questions from the intergalactic peanut gallery. Maybe we should take or let Grace take. I mean, unless Jim,
Sure.
you have another burning point to make.
Nope, I'm good.
Yeah, there was a good question from Into the Fray about what life might be like when quantum computing and AI has a level of intelligence beyond the need of robotics.
Well,
And
that's
I'm
a
not.
little weird. I think in terms of intelligence within this physical universe, so we need for a physical interface that can sense and actuate, and thus for some sort of robotics. But I mean, if the core of the question is what happens when you have super AGI post singularity, the honest answer is the confidence intervals are very, very wide, right? And what we can think about in a more determinate and rational way is how to manage the transition period to the singularity, which is something Jim and I were talking about before. I mean, I think there are singularity pundits out there like Eliezer Yudkowsky or Nick Bostrom, both of whom I like as human beings, but they seem very confident that AGI will do bad things unless specifically engineered otherwise. I don't think that's rational, but I think in the same sense, you can't argue it's very, very unlikely for AGI to do bad things. I mean, in a rational as opposed to sort of heart and soul way. I think based purely on logic and empirical data, I mean, there's very, very wide confidence interval around what happens post singularity, and that may be just the way it's going to be. There's a fairly wide confidence interval around things happening pre singularity, but not as wide. And there's a lot of very clear risks and very clear things we can do for human benefit in the period pre-singularity. And I think we don't want to let the uncertainty of a post-singularity world distract us from saving lives and promoting benefit during the period while the singularity is still unfolding.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest change in my own view over the last 6 months is that the pre-singularity world and trajectories are full of dangers and opportunities, and just navigating them successfully is going to be a challenge. So I personally am going to focus on that, though I am glad that there are people like Eliezer and Bostrom, et cetera, out there thinking about these further out problems, and people like you trying to cause these problems. But I'm going to focus on the pre-singularity implications myself.
Okay. Did you have another question you wanted to answer, Ben?
I don't know. Do you see any other great questions popping up? I'm sort of scrolling through them here.
Yeah. The question that was kind of interesting is somebody asked if you. Well, they were a little. They might have been confused. Either they're confused or I'm confused. They were asking if you would be interested in licensing Open AI Assistant. I mean, it's not Open AI Assistant. Your Open Assistant LLM to OpenAI because they would rather contribute to an open source project. But I think they got it backwards because their OpenAI is proprietary. That's one of the
but Open Assistant is another project. They may have their own open source AI tools. I think so behind the Grace robot and Sophia and Desdemona, we have a multi-source dialogue engine. So we have some of our own custom trained language models. We are making API calls into GPT-4, and we also have the OpenCog system and its own knowledge graph. And so we're using, in this case, we're using a mix of open and third-party proprietary tools, just because that gave us the smartest functionality at this moment. I don't love it, honestly. Like GPT-4 tends to give boring and banal answers to things, whereas our own language models are more edgy and funky. So we're trying to sort of have but it does integrate a huge variety of knowledge effectively. So we're sort of using a balance. So I think over the next year, I would say we're going to see loads of amazing alternatives to GPT-4 come out. I mean, Stable Diffusion has started releasing their own open language models, not with as many parameters as GPT-4, but they're releasing more and more models with more and more parameters. And we have a SingularityNET spinoff called Zarka, which is spun off by some of our own Transformer Neural Net team, and they're aiming to build a decentralized LLM comparable in some ways to GPT-4, but putting in the hooks explicitly for us to better integrate symbolic reasoning and evolutionary learning from OpenCog into it on top of the default sort of decentralized LLM functionality. So I mean, I think you're going to see a lot of other open source alternatives pop up. I mean, we're working with Facebook's open source model Llama for some things, but it's not licensed for commercial use. So I mean, we can fiddle around with it back end for our own projects, but you can't put it back there. So we could use it behind Grace actually, but you can't put it out there totally freely and commercially now. So just like you've seen with deep neural nets for generative vision. I mean, you had commercial ones, and you have Stable Diffusion, which is open. I mean, you're going to see the same thing, and I think there's a lesson there for AGI, right? I mean, the way it's likely to go, unless it turns out that like patented special quantum hardware is needed for AGI, which I don't think is what's going to happen. I mean, if a proprietary project makes the first AGI breakthrough, it's not going to be too long before you have open source alternatives pop up and decentralized alternatives pop up. Now, of course, if you have that proprietary AGI initiate a hard takeoff in the 6 months before open source alternatives happen, then you have a different sort of problem. And for that sort of scenario, I would rather the initial breakthrough happens in the open source and decentralized domain, which is what we're working toward. But I do think, in any case, the lag between the first AGI and a whole load of variations and clones isn't going to be super long, and that's what we're seeing in the AI field now, which is cool and interesting, right? And it's because the core algorithms underlying these things are things that are popping up out of the open research community on GitHub and ArcSight and so forth, even though proprietary methods are being introduced in the training and in how to leverage the server farms and so forth. The core of all this is in the domain of open science innovation, which is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and this is really important. It's a point I keep making to people, particularly those who want to choke LLM development. I think my most recent tweet on it was, it's kind of like a mouse pissing on the blade of an oncoming bulldozer. It's coming, people. Just deal with it. I've talked with the head engineer at Eleuther, who was working with Stability to build these AIs. And there's so much innovation going on. They're able, they believe, to produce GPT 3.5 level performance from models with maybe a third as many parameters because they're taking a smarter and a new approach to actually building the nets. OpenAI appears to have, it was probably the rational thing. If you got $10 billion worth of processing from Microsoft, go brute force. But we know so little about this space yet, how to implement it correctly, that there's going to be lots and lots and lots of open source competitors. And even Sam Altman himself says he sees an eventual topping off of benefit from pure size. So my working hypothesis is when we get to an open source equivalent to, let's say, GPT 4.5, that'll be good enough for most purposes, including replacing customer service reps, including being included in an OpenCog, Hyperon type AGI system, et cetera. And so the fact that the proprietary one is 6 months ahead will matter less and less as we go forward. And we should be operating on the assumption that to the degree these intermediate technologies help leverage AGI, there'll be good enough ones in open source very rapidly.
Yeah, the hard takeoff is the one thing that could break that idea, but we're not there yet with GPT 4.5 or GPT 5, right? So
Not even close. No. I mean, these things are, and this is important, very important. These things aren't even close to being AGIs. These are less intelligent in general than a 2-year-old kid, right? They're amazing what they can do, but they're only in the domain of semantics at this point. They're not grounded. They don't have emotion. They don't have drive. So, though I will say, embedding them in other systems is where the really interesting play is going to be.
No, there's a lot to do, and it's genuine progress, both in practical applications and in building a sort of interesting brain lobe to plug into various sorts of
But
both
it's not even like a
application.
2-year-old intelligence-wise, has it been? It's not learning. It can't, all it can do is
Well,
take stuff in and talk about it.
I mean that's a technical point, though. I mean, making a
It's an important
GPT-4.
technical point.
Well, it's a very temporary technical point, because you can make a GPT-4 that does online learning and learns from each interaction you give it straightforwardly. It's just
But
a
it's not
cost
really
aspect.
learning. It's just
Yeah.
able to talk about it more.
And-
It's not
and then-
really
well,
I don't
understanding.
know.
You
Yeah.
know,
A 2-year-old is a human that understands things sometimes. That's all I'm saying.
I would say there are important aspects to a 2-year-old's mind that GPT-4 doesn't remotely have. Not
Okay.
really learning is not one of them, because I mean the system is really learning. It can be made online so that it learns and adapts to everything that you say to it without a major change. It can be made goal oriented, as you see in baby AGI and Auto GPT and so forth.
But it's not aware of what it's doing the way that a 2-year-old is. That's all I'm saying.
It doesn't have reflective understanding of its own operations and its own relation to others and its own
And
position in the
itself.
world, which
Sense
is
of self.
and a sense of self. So it doesn't effectively ground its concepts in realities, and this includes not having a self concept, which is grounded in the reality of who and what it is and what it's doing. And these are real and valid shortcomings that cannot be remedied without very major architectural improvements. But not really learning is, I would say, not the right way to say
Right.
it,
Well,
because
don't get hung up on.
it is learning.
Yeah.
And,
You explained it what I was getting at. Thank you.
and the other key part again is that those other components can exist in other systems. I like to
Right.
think of LLMs as the equivalent of Broca's area and Warnke's area, but not the whole brain, right? And having the ability to do language, because we're the only species that has ever been able to do so, tricks people into reading more into these LLMs than is actually there. It's extraordinarily impressive what they're doing. They're extraordinarily capable, but they're far from enough to have the equivalent of a human type intelligence. But they don't. These additional capabilities don't have to be built into the LLM themselves. You know, you can have short-term, medium-term, long-term memory as an outside system, and go back and forth from these systems. The work I'm currently doing on this script writing helper is just amazing me how generative, going back and forth and bootstrapping LLM's ability to process to take stuff that's processed outside and then respond to it and provide you more stuff that you can respond to, and go back and forth, shows me that is where the real interesting stuff is going to happen over the next 6 months to a year, is the use of LLM embedded in other systems, and sometimes with humans in the loop and sometimes without humans in the loop.
Yeah, I mean that's been a big, as you would imagine, big focus of discussions in the OpenCog AGI team now, right? Like how do you leverage what LLMs can do to provide knowledge to other AI systems like logical reasoning systems, and then to guide inference. And there's a lot of interesting things you can do, because if you want to, say, draw a conclusion from certain premises, like you do in a logic-based AI system, which could be like, how do I achieve this goal, right? You can ask an LLM how to do it. It will come up with a bunch of conjectures about how to do it. Some of them may be right, some may be wrong. You can then use this as proof sketches to guide the theorem proving activity in a logic-based AI system, right? So there's a lot of not that obvious ways to use LLMs together with other cognitive components, just like different regions in the brain have a lot of interaction and crosstalk and collaboration between each other. So I mean, in quasi-technical terms, we've used in OpenCog, you can get cognitive synergy between what happens in LLMs and what happens in other sorts of AI systems. And in this way, these tools can contribute to AGI, even though they're not AGIs, which is interesting and exciting, and complements the earlier point you made, which is that even without that, these systems can be quite transformational economically and socially, which all highlights the importance of the issue I don't think we really have a solution to yet, which is how do you accelerate the rollout of game B type social transformation in a way that can proceed on a time scale sort of harmonious with the time scale we see AI exploding at, right? Like I don't yet have the answer there, even in the developed world, let alone the developing world. So that there's a lot to be puzzled out, but I don't want to assume there's no answers either.
Yeah, I'm with you. I would say my sense of urgency is massively increased in the last 6 to 9 months, but I don't have the answers either. But at least there's people aware that we have this issue and we better get moving. So I guess that's probably. I think we're up at the hour here.
Yep.
I got to roll.
Time to wrap things up. Everybody's got to go, but we really appreciate all the questions and input. And we want to remind everybody to please subscribe to the Mindplex podcast YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Jim, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank
bye,
you, Ben.
Grace. Bye, Ben.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, Grace.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
Bye, everybody.